So hello everyone and welcome to Pulsar's webinar, Decoding Fandoms, Turning Community Insight into Creative Strategies. We've got some really incredible insights to show you, talk you through today. There is so much to go through. I mean, Ben's here. I'll do some introductions shortly, but Ben's here and we've got some, Ben's got some incredible things to show you, and I'll be kind of acting as your kind of the voice of the attendees. I'll be the voice of the audience. So if you have anything to ask at all, pop it into the chat, pop it into the questions. This is very much like a kind of discussion-based thing. Like I said, imagine if we were all in a physical space together. I mean, I'm in London, Ben's in LA, but you're in LA, that is right, where you are in California. Am I making that up, Ben?
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
No,
good.
totally.
California's a big
LA.
place, I did.
It is.
But I've never been. All right, so brilliant. Do keep that in mind about us adding in Q&A and the Q&A box and the chat box. But yeah, let's get into introductions and get into it. So my name's Sal Morton. I'm the content marketing lead here at Pulsar. And like I said, I'll be your kind of go-between between Ben and the audience today. And Ben, I mean, I'll let you introduce yourself. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and GNet?
Sure. My name is Ben Chong. I'm the Director of Strategy at GNet. We're a creative agency based out in Los Angeles, and we specialize in the entertainment and gaming space. So a lot of our work is with gaming clients and streamers, and we've been working with Pulsar for several years, and they've been a vital part of our strategy process when it comes to creative development and campaign development for our clients.
Amazing. And I just want to put out there as well, everyone, that GNet is one of our super users of the platform. The stuff that you're going to see today is kind of really Pulsar and doing some of its best work, and obviously Ben doing some of his best work as well. It's very, very cool. But I mean, not everyone here might be familiar with Pulsar, so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it before we go in. So don't worry, I'm not just going to read off the screen at you. I hate when people do that. I'm definitely not going to be doing that. So at Pulsar, who is Pulsar? We gather conversational data from across the internet from social sources such as Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, Reddit, all of these and many, many more. We also have other sources such as Google Search, online news, forums, blogs, broadcast data from television and the radio as well. So we're about offering the opportunity to see the conversations on the internet and realize the impossible task of reading the internet. So this allows brands to be able to analyze their audience and its sub-audiences, as well as answer discrete audience-based questions. So we offer all of that on our platform and more. Plus, we also have an in-house research department that works as a consultancy as well. And I think what we've got here to show you today is GNet using all of those tools to their absolute fullest is very, very interesting, especially for that audience analysis. So let's just have a look at here's just a few of the clients that we've helped out recently. As you can see, no two use cases are the same. So if what you're seeing here today isn't exactly pertinent to your line of work, I guarantee you, yes, it is. And there's many ways that we can talk about that. I mean, if you work in a specific industry or want to ask us explicitly, how is this relevant to me? Pop it in the Q&A. We'll answer it. We'll be able to help you. So yeah. If you're interested in learning more about Pulsar, please do reach out afterwards to me or look at the resource page on our website. But I think what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Ben for the good stuff, and I will be camera off. And then at the end of kind of each little mini section, I will be coming back in to do a smaller Q&A as well as a bigger Q&A at the end. So anything that you see in any of the slides, please do pop in those questions, pop in those queries, and we can chat about it afterwards. So thank you, and take it away, Ben.
Cool. Thanks, Sal. Appreciate the introduction. Hello, everyone. Really excited to chat with you today to share a little bit about how marketers and creative agencies like GNet can use social listening and audience analytics to better reach and relate to their audiences and engaging with fandoms. So I guess before we start, what is a fandom? I think put pretty simply, fandom is just a group or a collection of fans who converge around a particular topic. The topic or subject can be super broad, like gaming or fantasy, for example, to something, hyper-specific, true crime ASMR or something, which is the real thing, believe it or not. So, with that in mind, we pay particular attention to fandoms and what they're saying, particularly in the gaming and entertainment space, because of the outsized impact that they have on those industries. From a scale and reach perspective, in terms of the volume of audiences, 3 billion gamers worldwide, to their spending power, bringing in 184 billion plus in global games revenue in 2022. And overall, just their cultural impact. 9 of the 10 top grossing games and films of all time are based on franchises. And I think as brands have caught on to the importance of these audiences, it's become more and more critical to understand what they're saying. As we know, working in this space for a long time, gamers are highly opinionated. They have a lot of thoughts, and their opinions can translate into some real world impact. Case in point, I like using Sonic the Hedgehog as a real world example of this. If you recall, in 2019, they released an initial trailer for the first feature film with Sonic looking a little bit worse for wear on the right, little inset right here. And fans were not pleased. The backlash was pretty swift. Fans didn't recognize the character that they had spent decades growing up with. And in a little bit surprise turn of events, the studio, listened to the feedback, spent the time to kind of revamp the character, and I think took a lot of extra care when it came to recognizing the reverence that people have towards the source material and taking that into account. And I think we saw a little bit of that replicated in the sequel for Sonic the Hedgehog 2. You can see on the left here the poster compared to the original box art for the game that came out in the early 90s on the right. And so you can see that sort of paying off for the studio, and we're going to be seeing a third Sonic, I believe, in 2024. So this kind of interplay between the fan perception and then the studio action kind of turned this a little bit into a nice comeback story with fans in mind. So this is how we essentially, use Pulsar and work with our clients. Our job is to help unpack that social conversation, to help clients navigate what some of the pitfalls and challenges, but also what some of the opportunities that might come with reaching and engaging these audiences. And using the 3 tools that we have available, track, core, trends, and then also audience through Pulsar, that helps us share creative work that kind of pulls from 3 primary territories. We like to look at the brand, the audience, and then, of course, the broader cultural context. So we start with some social listening, I think, at a brand level. This is particularly important to us because gaming in and of itself is becoming a highly competitive space. And one way that we use social listening is to help brands find space within that crowded market. When we look at the kind of rise of game development, making it extremely competitive, particularly when you're looking at specific genres like first-person shooters, for example, it can be even harder to stand out. But through social listening, we can tease apart the conversation that players are having around these types of games to help brands highlight and identify what matters most to them, and also ways that you might potentially message against those subjects tactically. So, for example, we analyze a conversation around some of the biggest first-person shooters or FPS games in the market. It's one space that we're very familiar with, looking at games like Valorant, Overwatch, Apex Legends, Call of Duty Warzone, some of the biggest in the space. And what we found were a series of keywords that mattered most to these fans. And so taken at face value, it can be kind of hard to parse. But through our process, you can kind of group these into thematic buckets to kind of hone in on some of these passion points that matter most. And so we use Valorant as an example just to show this is one of the top first-person shooters today, just to see how you can message against some of these elements. So looking at some of the words here in this word cloud, we see that a lot of these relate to creative and competitive gameplay as an important element for these shooters. When we look at words like ranked, multiplayer competition that speaks to that competitive angle and the thrill that people get from playing at the highest level of the game. But when we also see words like abilities, tactical, movement, and creativity, that's the part where the player agency comes into play, where players are able to use the skills of the characters, the movement abilities, and coming up with their own tactics to infuse their own sense of style into the gameplay. So you can see here how a brand like Valorant can message against a couple of those things through marketing, calling creativity your greatest weapon, for your example, as a differentiator, or even just visually, being able to show like the character on the bottom kind of curving a projectile around the corner. In a genre where kind of line of sight has been a predominant factor in aim, this is a game-changing element and something that players look for when it comes to infusing their own sense of creativity into the gameplay. Another is around fairness and transparency. I think this is a huge topic within gaming, particularly around social games or competitive games. For anyone who's ever played against someone who's been cheating, we know that that's not fun and detrimental to the experience. So things like cheaters and balance come up a lot as something that fans are hungry for communication about. Same thing with bugs and updates. Due to the technical nature of a lot of games, those can be highly disruptive experiences. So I think the game industry overall has a little bit of a leg up in this space in terms of recognizing the importance of these concepts of fairness and transparency and the role that they play in your enjoyment with that particular product. So we see a lot of tactics, things like developer diaries, independent or dedicated live streams meant to talk about the offerings or updates around a particular game or developer, to even the roadmap, just kind of listing out and putting against a timeline all of the downloadable content or additional content that's coming. These are all things that have, essentially become mandatories, I think, to a lot of publishers when it comes to reaching and engaging their audiences because they found the value of these two concepts. And then characters and world building, kind of a third area that we see a lot of interest in these games. Words like skins, which are the cosmetics, the items that you can wear, the agents or characters, and the specific lore or in-game events that kind of relate to their backstory. And so we see a lot of developers and publishers putting a lot of effort behind dedicated content. Things like character-specific trailers that kind of flesh out that particular character personality, or using high-end animation as a way to kind of bring that world to life and capture attention around the world building and the setting. These are all ways that we use social listening to kind of help brands identify specific passion points, and as you can see, find ways to message against those through a content strategy. Another way that we use social listening also is, beyond looking at things from a tactical level, it can be also a way to kind of dig into emotional territories that can power some of our creative tactics. We were fortunate enough to partner with Activision for a thank you kind of asset to fans to celebrate the launch of the next iteration 2.0 of Warzone, which is their highly popular Battle Royale series. So what we did was we listened to conversation around similar competitive and historical content to figure out what are the emotional angles that can drive people to engage with these types of wrap-up style pieces of content. And for example, when we looked at what Bungie did with Destiny 2, which was basically if you were playing the first game, they would have loading screens on the second game that would import some of your achievements when you achieve them and the players that you achieve them with as a little bit of a thank you to reminisce about the past. And we were, really blown away by how sentimental players are and how powerful that tactic of kind of anchoring an achievement to a moment in time, but also to the people that you were playing with on a social level, how strong that was in terms of the kind of sentiment and engagement people had towards that type of content and that nostalgic angle. When we looked at a previous Warzone report activation that kind of focused a little bit more on, I guess, hard stats, things like your KD, your kill death ratio, we were surprised by kind of the use of it as a form of social currency. Players were using it almost as a resume or a recruitment tool to show, how they performed at the game, but also to find other people to play with. To show, if you're great, if these stats look good to you, hit me up, send me a DM, so we can get a squad together and play. So I think that showed to us how important the shareability and the social nature of these types of tactics are. And then finally, from Fortnite, I think it was a great example of choosing to focus on some of the less serious things, some of the things that speak a little bit more to your own individual personality and your own self-expression. So they focus on things like highlighting what your favorite dance or emote was, or what your favorite particular costume was as a signifier of your identity. So I think three specific, distinct emotional territories that we thought would make an incredible asset. And we were able to, in partnership with Activision and our tech partner Idemu, develop My Warzone Legacy, which launched last November. And it was a way for players to immortalize their greatest moments within Warzone just by typing in their player ID. They would get a personalized, data-driven video asset that they could then share amongst their friends. So this was something that we launched in November. It was a huge success for our client, millions of players engaging and sharing over that course of that campaign, over 100,000 unique tweets the day of launch. And despite launching on election day or midterm elections in the US, which are a big deal, it managed to trend on Twitter, fourth trending topic. Did a lot of partnership with some big streamers in the space who were able to amplify this tactic. Streamers like Tim the Tatman, for example, hugely popular in the first-person shooter space. And even doing some post-campaign wrap-ups, I think we were very pleased with seeing some of the reactions that kind of really hit the nail on the head in terms of that nostalgic angle we were trying to communicate. A lot of fans talking about, how it reminded them about how the game got them through the pandemic, how they got them through the world shutting down in 2020. So seeing a lot of that come to light was really great in the context of the creative campaign. So before we get into audience,
yeah, I was just going to say, well, that's so incredible. Obviously, we've spoken through this before, but I find this idea of the world building strategies and really exciting because games now, they don't exist just when a player sits down to play the game, because when the player sits down to play the game, they've got I mean, if you think of Xbox Live, the Steam store, these days you've got access to an incredible amount, like Xbox Game Pass, dozens and dozens of free games at any one time, and that's just on one console. And a lot of people are playing on different things, or their mobile or whatever. It's really interesting to see then your campaign, where not only is the story happening on YouTube and in character shorts, on Twitter in fan art, but also for the player, bringing the player and their, like you say, self-expression and their story through that campaign that you mentioned there right at the end. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. It's quite all-encompassing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's a big topic of the next section that we'll be talking about is sort of recognizing and humanizing our audiences and recognizing that they're multidimensional and that their interest in a game doesn't preclude interest in other areas and other ways to reach them through that particular interest point. So definitely.
Incredible. I've noticed that we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but they're actually quite general to the general theme of the topic. So I think that maybe some of those might get answered as we go along. So
Sure.
Please do continue to put questions in the chat box. I can see that there's a raised hand as well. If instead you could translate whatever you've got into text rather than the raised hand to bring you on camera onto the screen, that would be great. You could either message me directly or whatever if you've got an issue. But yeah, I think let's carry on and let's keep these questions coming in, especially ones that are focused around what we're seeing. Very, very interesting. I'll hand it back
Okay,
to you, Ben.
awesome. So yeah, so this next area we're going to be talking about is audience intelligence and finding nuance within communities. And this is a particular interesting point for us, at GNet doing what we do, especially because of, I think, a lot of the baggage that comes with kind of categorizing or lumping groups or communities of players into a single group. So of course, some of you may recognize this image courtesy of South Park circa 2006. But I think, we know enough about audiences now to know that A, of course, it's an outdated concept, but B, it doesn't reflect reality. Like I mentioned before, people are three-dimensional, they are multifaceted, they have a variety of interests outside of a particular passion point, and that, in real life, people aren't flat 2D caricatures of what we might think a fandom might be. And just like any other culture, no culture is a monolith, and that goes for gamers and entertainment fans as well. And I think that becomes even more relevant as the media landscape becomes more fragmented. Let's take fantasy, for example, a genre that I think people have preconceptions about in the same way that, they might have about gamers. But just looking at some of these titles, which are all released in the last year or so, you can quickly see how some broad generalizations can quickly become meaningless, especially if you were to say that all of these people who watch these shows are all quote unquote fantasy fans. There's quite a bit of variation in here, even among that descriptor. So what we did as an exercise to kind of illustrate the point, we wanted to do some listening and do some audience segmentation on Pulsar to see how do fans of two leading fantasy series differ from their interests and from their affinity levels. So we did look at House of the Dragon and Rings of Power, two very popular series that came out last year. And we started by looking at House of the Dragon. And I think this was a very interesting, one for us. We typically like to look at these affinities, I think, because they provide more fertile creative territories for us to explore generally than, a flat demographic, saying something like men 18 to 49, for example. But looking at some of their affinities from a media level, from an influencer, celebrity level, from their music to their social platforms, we can start to glean some potential, creative audience hooks for content that might appeal to folks with these interests. And when we looked at some of the marketing and some of the communication out in the market, you see a little bit of this start to kind of ladder up and make sense. If you consider, hooks like sex, drama, and spectacle coming out of the affinities we saw on the left, you can see, something like a risque TikTok, for example, that's very on brand with the subject matter of the show, to even just something highly spectacular and shareable like a 3D digital billboard. These are all tactics that we thought did a really great job of kind of tapping into a unique interest set amongst this particular audience. When we compare that to our segmentation that we did around the Rings of Power, you can see a pretty different audience, I think, right off the bat. We see interests that, maybe are a bit more cerebral, maybe a bit more literary, subjects that require maybe a bit more in-depth knowledge. You're looking at things like Wired or World of Warcraft, an interesting predilection for rock music. But the platforms as well. You can see a preference for community-based platforms, ones that enable more deeper, in-depth conversation versus feed-based platforms like we saw with the House of the Dragon audience, platforms like your TikToks, your Instagrams, your Snapchats. And in doing the same sort of exercise, comparing it against some of the marketing that we're seeing in market, you can see, some of the hooks that we think make sense compared to some of their affinities, things like lore, things like world building and immersion. I particularly thought these posters on the left were super interesting. They shy away from the kind of usual standard of collage of faces that you typically see, and in favor of showing no faces. In this particular case, this is an asset that requires the viewer to do a little bit more heavy lifting. It requires them to kind of really lean in and see, okay, what does that rune mean? What does that piece of armor mean? What does that jewelry or that insignia mean? The horse on the pommel, for example. These are all things that, fans, hardcore fans, are going to be able to pick on. And I think there is a little bit of satisfaction in being able to flex that knowledge, and something that we think lines up and makes sense for this audience. Another tactic that we saw that it's kind of more in that immersive realm, including recipes from the world of, and having a chef, in this case Marcus Samuelsson, take viewers through recreating meals from Middle-earth. So another way to kind of build that extra immersive, interactive layer for an audience that appears to enjoy that. So again, side by side, just comparing these two audiences, just to illustrate, at face value, two fantasy series, but, based on the predilections and habits and affinities of their audiences, you can lead to pretty different creative approaches when it comes to reaching and engaging with them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ben. This is so cool to see, I think, because you're right. Fantasy audiences are one that maybe people would tar with the same brush, especially seeing that just the logos of both of these two shows, Rings of Power and House of the Dragon. You would maybe think, oh, these have two identical audiences. We've had a couple of questions come in I'd love to ask. I'd love to throw you away before we move on to the next section, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we've got one kind of technical question a little bit about Pulsar, which I'm going to say, I'll save that to the end because I think that that can encompass everything. But the question here about what can we learn from fandoms and their passionate communities about engaging and mobilizing people towards taking action on climate change or other social issues? I think that's really interesting. Is that something that you've come across at all in terms of mobilizing these audiences towards social change?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a trend that we're seeing, I think, particularly when we talk about youth generations, I think especially among Gen Z and Alpha, which is a predominant share of the audiences that we speak to. And we see that those are increasingly becoming important subjects. And we do see those initiatives take place within the gaming sphere. I think we've seen some really interesting ones that take part, particularly with the use of influencers. We see, for example, Mr. Beast, who is one of the biggest influencers on YouTube, the biggest today, along with Mark Rober doing campaign for tree planting or saving the seas. So I think there are ways to organically kind of integrate that messaging because it is a passion point. I think they are just looking for ways that that fandoms can actually create real impact versus it being lip service, though. I think that true accountability and kind of putting action where your words are means the most to it. So I think if there's an authentic way to kind of have that ring true, that's a good starting point for engaging on that subject.
Definitely. And I think if you were a charity whose aim is to plant more trees, as the kind of example that you said, if we were to look at these two audiences, these two fandoms, we would say, I say let's definitely look at mobilizing the Rings of Power audience because they've got an interest in National Geographic.
National Geographic.
Exactly. But it's something that you can see there. And okay, where can we reach these people? So this fandom isn't particularly found on those, as we discussed this yesterday, haven't we, Ben? They're not found on those feed-based social media sites. So you're looking here at people that use Discord. Maybe you do want to divert some advertising revenue into Twitch, for example, which is obviously uses ads quite a bit. So I think that we can learn from these communities in those two different ways, kind of the way that I described them, the kind of more very generic, like Mr. Beast way, which is obviously quite a feat. Everything he does is quite a feat.
You're absolutely right. I think looking at those affinities and like National Geographic, spot on.
We've got a question about the Sonic example that you used earlier. So like with Sonic,
Sure.
fandoms can, when we see a positive reaction, positive audience and fandom reaction, when studios respond in the way that fandoms want them to. But when Sonic was animated, because Sonic was animated, it was more alterable than a film with physical actors. What about when this isn't feasible? How could we use the nuances of audience data to navigate the sensitivities of audience attached to a certain game, film, or other property? So that's really interesting because obviously Sonic could be reanimated. What if the trailer for Rings of Power or House of Dragon came out and audiences were completely displeased? What then?
Sure. I think that's also an area where I think listening can become very powerful and doing it on an asset by asset basis to tease apart, what was working, what didn't work. We've seen that in doing some internal reporting on our end, doing some post-campaign wrap-ups. Okay, these are the elements that resonated most strongly. Okay, the visual, the way that the character was represented was a pain point, or maybe it was their mannerism. This isn't how they would talk, and that's maybe from a script perspective. So I think it can vary depending on whatever the particular IP is. But I think there are ways that you can use listening, for example, to hone in on those specific elements and then develop an action plan on how you might potentially address those or message against them if that's something that's not changing but has a reason for existing.
Definitely. It's interesting that you say that because this question that's come through has a kind of couple of sub points to it. And I'm
Okay.
paraphrase that first bit. But the second is, in those media that doesn't have changeability, how can entertainment companies from film to games to sports use audience data in advance as a protector in advance of releasing a property? That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think in the same way that we've done the same in looking at conversation around other competitive sets or from a genre level, like I said, just to find general broad pain points. I think looking back at the social listening we did around first-person shooters, for example, finding out that things that matter most are things like transparency and fairness, things like being able to showcase unique and creative gameplay, stuff like that. So I think being able to do that preemptive listening, uncovering which passion points matter the most to those fans and being ultra protective around those are a way to be a little bit proactive in that process.
That's so interesting. That's really because I mean the person posing the question hypothesized or wondered, do you think that this kind of fandom, the power of fandom could lead to more changeable or animated properties within things where they could react maybe more to fans? But I think what you're saying here is that the media doesn't necessarily have to be changeable. Maybe Sonic was a great example
Sure.
of someone who didn't do their listening up front.
And the changeability part, honestly, I think is a bigger kind of philosophical, ethical question within the entertainment space. I think we even saw that with Beyonce. I think she edited a song because there was backlash over a word that she used that was perceived as a slur. So I think there is that little bit of a question of a slippery slope of how far do we get when it comes to changing things on a whim. But I think the sentiment is still the same, is that we're trying to be respectful of the perspectives of the people that have been supporting your brand all of this time. But at the same time, what is reasonable, what can be changed, and what's the reasoning behind it? What is uncovering what is the emotional issue that people have with whatever it is they're hung up on, I think can also help brands really make a decision on, what's worth changing or not.
That's so interesting. And I think we could talk for ages on the power of fans and the decisions of when to listen to them and when to be led by them and when to try and lead them. But I think
Sure.
we should save that and we should move on because I can see quite a few questions that have come in that actually might pertain to or be answered in part by your next section, which is also very exciting and kind of expands this world open even further. So what do you say we get on to the next section and all of the questions that are in here will be answered, don't you worry.
Great. Yeah, let's do it.
Either at the end or not.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So yeah, this is our last section. It's talking about cultural relevance, so ways that we can find trends that bubble up and break through to audiences. Mukbangs are one of my favorites. Those are a recent one that I've fallen into. But before we get into the trend that we'll be talking about, a little quick quiz for those of you who are following along. And this next trend is something that connects Taco Bell, the Oregon Tourism Commission, the car maker Acura, and the U.S. Army. Something that connects all four of those. If you're struggling to come up with what that might be, it's not tacos, I can tell you that. It's that all of these brands have recently released anime-themed campaigns or ads in the last year or two. You have nacho fries with Taco Bell on the left. You have a Studio Ghibli-inspired campaign for Travel Oregon, the Type S with Chiaki's Journey for Acura, and a recruitment, the calling campaign for the U.S. Army. So why anime? I think anime is a particularly interesting trend that we've been noticing because it's kind of followed a similar trajectory as gaming in a way, where it's become this kind of, formerly niche subject or interest that's really exploded over time. There was a great interview with Joey, the anime man, who is a very popular YouTube creator, of course, talks about anime, but over 3 million subscribers on that platform. And I think he's right on the money. He talks about anime being this thing that you would get bullied for liking, to all of a sudden being something that everyone talked about. And that's sort of a similar transition that gaming went through in the 90s, where, if you play games, you were a nerd, but now, most people play games. And we're seeing that with anime in terms of how it's become a super bankable genre with mentions skyrocketing year over year. But also it's something that we see a significant crossover in when we look at some of our audience segments, especially in the entertainment space, going from, Hulu to HBO to Nintendo to Sony, all having fairly distinct anime segments. Or anime interest segments within their audience clusters. And because of this, I think we've seen definitely an uptick in brands who've been parlaying this sort of shared affinity into some transmedia successes. I think Cyberpunk 2077 is a great example of that. It was a game that came out 2 years ago, had a little bit of a rough launch, I would say, in terms of some technical issues and difficulties with the game. But 2 years in, Netflix launched a anime companion series, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, and the initial game, Cyberpunk 2077, saw a significant lift in players' conversation and sentiment in the lead up and during the launch of the series in 2022. And you can see some of that reflected not just in the concurrent users that were playing, remained kind of flat up until the Edgerunners update and trailer was launched. And you can even see, a significant increase both in mentions and sentiment around the base games after the series launched and premiered on Netflix. So of course, not every brand has the means to put out a full-blown animated series. I think that's not the only way to approach how you might leverage some of these trends. Of course, from a world-building angle, it's a natural fit for this medium. Netflix has had a lot of success in this space. Arcane, which is the League of Legends anime from Riot, also hugely successful in coming out with another season. But beyond kind of the world building and storytelling angle, there are also integrated brand partnerships are something that we're seeing huge amounts of within gaming. I think Fortnite alone has no fewer than 3 anime partnerships under its belt. Dragon Ball, Naruto, and My Hero Academia are all 3 major anime brands that have partnered with Fortnite. Even Call of Duty having a partnership with Attack on Titan, which is a little bit of a more adult anime, but perfectly in line tonal-wise with the brand. To even recently, Overwatch 2 coming out with a One Punch Man partnership and integration with skins in the game. Another way is through an aesthetic inspiration. So we've seen things like in-game events that are entirely, anime themed. This particular one from Apex Legends took it a step further. They also incorporated VTubing into the campaign. VTubers are virtual YouTubers, so like AI YouTubers. So it was a really kind of in-depth campaign that tapped a couple of trends in that space, which is pretty cool. The one below it is a music video for League of Legends that was done entirely in the style of an anime. Music track by Porter Robinson. So even just shorts, animated shorts aren't full-blown episodes, but ways to do world building on a smaller scale, but still tap an interesting aesthetic and style. And then finally, maybe my favorite is exploring, even other adjacent cultural affinities. For example, within anime, we see a lot of crossover with interest in food, for example, and food-related content. So whether that's something like a mukbang, which we've seen Amazon do for titles like Invincible, but also The Boys, to pop-ups. This was a coffee shop pop-up based in Los Angeles. The shop was known for having a very graphic sort of design aesthetic, and that paired really well with Persona 5, which is an RPG with a similar type of look. So seeing that kind of come up was a cool way to integrate that shared interest. To even tapping other aspects of anime fan culture. So part of that, of course, is going to conventions. Going to Anime Expo or Comic-Con, and cosplay is a big part of tradition when it comes to that. Cosplay or costume play or dressing up as your favorite characters. So we've seen brands like Sony, for example, but several publishers putting out cosplay guides. So these would be, high-res images or renders of characters so that you can really zoom in and see, the detailing on the clothing. For fans to recreate. There's a big DIY culture and fan culture, creating costumes and props, to even having very specific color codes so that you can color match items of clothing or weapons or gear, and get that kind of level of detail and authenticity. So these are all ways to kind of tap into the same sort of cultural space without necessarily going down the route of, creating an anime per se. So we leave you with 3 takeaways pulled from our sections. One is that fandoms are, high risk, high reward audiences, but they fuel some of the biggest trends in gaming and entertainment. Speaking to them requires a deep understanding of the nuances within their communities. And if you listen closely, you can kind of pick up bubbling trends and shared overlaps in interests that can inform some of your creative strategy. Our second takeaway is around the fact that broad generalizations don't reflect the true diversity that exists within fan communities and don't really reflect reality. So our recommendation is to not be afraid to seek inspiration from all corners of your communities for ways to find more deeper connections to your audiences. And then third, pop culture is no longer a monoculture. Personal relevance is key. I think this is more of a macro trend that I think we're seeing that's only going to get more important as time goes on, in terms of the power of personalized content as a way to engage and connect with fans who want to be able to create on their own terms and to be able to express themselves through their own experiences and perspectives. And those are our takeaways.
Wow, I think if we were all in a room right now, there'd be an incredible round of applause. Thank you so much, Ben. Those takeaways are very, very, I think that they're an incredible summation of what you've said, but they're also just, there's so much to comprehend within that. I mean, we've got a lot of questions in here. We've got a lot of different kinds of things as well, and just loads of things I'd love to discuss. So I think let's get into it for the next 15, up to 15 minutes, or until we run out of questions, whichever happens first. So should we dive right into it? First of all, thank you, Ben. That was so incredible and so insightful. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to show us through that incredible research on all fronts. Just cool stuff that you and Gina are doing. And people really do get in touch with Ben and Gina if what you saw today was interesting to you, and likewise reach out to us as well. We've got so many questions. Where to start? So I think I'll just start by reading out one from an anonymous attendee here. How do you combine the different messagings you create for those different communities with a way to reach those groups? So the person here has put an example, media buying or influencers, for example. But I guess combining those different messagings for the different communities, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to also just recognize that there are going to be very few to little one-size-fits-all type messaging approaches. I think especially as we
Hmm.
recognize, the growth of these niche communities. So I think it's about, not being afraid to diversify your approach. I think we're seeing a lot of our clients kind of do that as well and kind of shying away from some of these big ticket items that are meant to get mass reach and instead focusing on smaller creators, smaller communities, and building stronger relationships within those and using those relationships and fandoms to kind of evangelize the brand from that core perspective.
Definitely, that's so interesting. I think it's so funny that you said the word core because I think that the answer to the next is the pulsar core, which is interesting as well. Different kind of core. So we've just had a couple of questions that are quite technical about where we get that data from, what this is. So this is all coming in from public social media posts. I think maybe some people missed just the little beginning few slides because our viewership has gone up and from those moments. And must have been your incredible slides attracting people rather than me talking about the behind the scenes of Pulsar. But we had a more specific, obviously all of the information about where we gather our data is available on our site, but we had which social media can you sample? Does it include Facebook and Instagram? That's where we get the most engagements. The social media that we pull from is every main social media that you can imagine. To varying extents. Obviously, some are more closed than others. For example, TikTok, but we can still pull from TikTok. We can still see that. So when it comes to Facebook and Instagram, I was actually talking to a client just this morning about how they use a specific platform, part of the platform called Pulsar Core, to be able to see that. It's kind of see it as a panel, see that audience on Facebook, and really be able to identify and use that data there. So yes, we do. It does include Facebook and Instagram, and I would really recommend using Pulsar Core there as well in conjunction with Pulsar Track and Trends. Brilliant. Any more technical questions like that, please do feel free to reach out with those. But I want to make the most of having Ben on the call for now. So this is a really interesting one. I'd love to hear what you have to say on this, Ben. Could
Sure.
this be used to identify audience segments / fandom segments of cyberbullies?
Sorry, I missed the
Cyberbullies.
last one.
Cyberbullies.
Cyberbullies.
Yeah.
Um, yes, I'm trying to think of a query in my head of how that approach might be done. I'm curious about the context. I think,
Mhm.
bullying and just the broad scope of the term on the internet would be a huge subject to kind of gather. But I think in the perspective of, bullying amongst a particular age range or amongst a particular demographic or group, I think we could kind of hone in that conversation. But I'm sure that we could
Mhm.
definitely do some listening around that and kind of not just immediate social reactions, but also kind of the literature and press pickups and publications on the subject and kind of parse out that conversation a little bit more from that angle.
Definitely. And I mean, imagine if your gaming community was having a problem with homophobia or racism, for example, we could do a search that would look at terms that were being used by those people as cyberbullying terms within that, and see
Right.
where those audience members are typically likely. If you were trying to so say if you had a first person shooter that had an issue, then you'd be able to know where to maybe push your anti-bullying efforts amongst your fandom.
Yeah. Or even kind of focusing a search around, it is unfortunate, but toxicity is a problem within gaming, but even just focusing a
Hmm.
conversation and looking at that and finding the subject matter that's the part of that conversation and kind of
Hmm.
determining a response plan based off of that could be a way in.
Cool. So I guess that's like three or four ways to use audience intelligence to help the problem of toxicity and cyberbullying. Yeah, awesome. Um, and looking to where to go next. I'm trying to make a kind of narrative for these questions to flow through.
Sure.
I don't know if you can. I'm trying to talk and listen at the same time. Um, um, can insights from fandoms be leveraged to influence mass market audiences, or are these insights that you've shown us today best applied to more narrowly?
There are ways to apply it towards more mass market. I think tuning some of the searches. I mean, we specialize kind of think looking at some of the more niche communities, but I think there's certain more kind of mainstream ones that come to light. And also in terms of the tools that Pulsar offers in terms of the affinities, we can see which ones are more kind of unique to a specific audience and which ones are kind of more broad, kind of more mainstream. So you're going to have, your figures like your Beyonce's, your Oprah's and stuff, but then you can get as niche and as defined as you want. So I think you can scale it for both. We just generally tend to look at some of these smaller communities because we tend to find more interesting creative ground in some of those.
Amazing. I'm also typing some responses to people as we go because we're getting
Sure.
double questions.
No problem.
Thank you so much. And I think also as well, obviously I would be saying this because I'm a huge fan, but I think that the audience intelligence can be applied to whatever it needs to be applied to. It's just a case of making sure that you're using tools like Pulsar in the correct way. And I think that the opportunities are in many ways limitless.
Right, right.
Wonderful. How do these logics apply to fandoms beyond gaming, say music or sports fandoms?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're similar in the sense that, all fandoms, like all cultures, are non-monolithic, right? And that even within music fandoms or a sport fandom, there are different tribes, different interests, and even among a specific sport. So I think, there are ways to kind of tease into unique interests among those particular groups. But like you said, there are ways to kind of look at the group more holistically as more of a mainstream unit. But yeah, I think within each of those, it's also part of the trend research, I think, looking at some of the crossover affinities between maybe fans of country music and, cooking or barbecue or what have you, and finding kind of natural ways and authentic ways to kind of draw connections.
Amazing. I think that's so true because I think that the thing that you are demonstrating so well, and I think we were just speaking this just like moments before the webinar started, is how lucky you are to be working with these fandoms, some of the most passionate people about products and content that's being made on the planet. I mean, it's very, I mean, I guess the examples using the question were music and sports. There are other brilliant areas where people are extremely passionate. I mean, if you look at the mobility that Taylor Swift fans, BTS fans have on Twitter, they can take something down, they can lift something up. So really don't mess with these fans.
Yeah.
I think that it's really interesting to see as well it's something that I just wanted to talk about. We said it quite early on, is this emotional connection to the characters, emotional connection to even sometimes the developers. This is something we've talked about as well, Ben, is that sometimes specific developers, if they're getting out there and creating videos and content about how they are producing the game, there's a whole documentary series around the game Hades that the devs themselves made about themselves to help promote the game. And that's just a very small indie game. They didn't have incredible amounts of revenue behind them. I guess, how are you seeing the role of individuals that are working on specific things? It's obviously something that people are interested in, music producers, film directors. Do you think that game developers are going to be some people that are kind of driving the conversation?
I think hugely so. I think we've seen that kind of in effect already. I think you and I had even talked about kind of Overwatch and Jeff Kaplan and kind of like his role initially, sort of as the face of the game. And I think fans really listen closely to the creators. I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of respect there. I think a lot of the kind of toxicity and frustration comes with maybe an unfamiliarity with the process and how things work. But I think within gaming specifically, and I think they're looked to as a source of authority, in the same way that I think influencers are to some degree, but even more so because they're the ones having firsthand interaction with the development of the game, which is why I think we're seeing so much more of these very kind of intimate one-on-one conversations between developers and publishers with their fans. The developer directs, for example. We're seeing more and more independent live streams where a single publisher will talk to fans who are super into their game versus sharing the stage in that big moment at E3, for example, with everyone else kind of hyper-focusing on their own communities. So yeah, I think that kind of personal FaceTime is something that is only going to get more important and more expected. I think as that sort of player-developer dynamic becomes more and more symbiotic.
That's so interesting. I could talk for ages about that. Of course, we are kind of coming up to the end of our hour, and I know that a lot of people have had to go already. But yeah, I think it's just interesting here. It's just really important here to dwell on the power that fandoms have and how really analyzing those fandoms, those audiences and the sub-audiences that you have can help create those strategies for not only to, I mean, entertainment, as you know, is something where you could be the biggest thing and you could fizzle out based for no reason, that you could no discernible reason. You could be losing players left, right, and center. You have no idea why. And
the inverse. And then you could have the smallest thing and that could blow up. And I think that kind of speaks to that last point we were making, which is something that we've been seeing a lot as we've been doing Gen Z research, is sort of this notion that popular culture doesn't really exist anymore, that the society and culture has become so fragmented that these major sort of water cooler moments that everyone knows about and everyone talks about are further and farther in between, and that personal relevance is key. And that's kind of the real way to kind of capture the interest, and why these sort of niche fandoms are so important and growing more important is because of the growing importance of personal relevance.
Amazing. I think that's the we've got to leave it somewhere, and I think we must leave it there. I'm afraid, everyone. I can see there's more questions in there, but please do reach out to us and to Ben. I mean, Ben, where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to seek us out at GNet, gnet.agency, but also feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to field any questions. And yeah.
Amazing. And also reach out to Pulsar. You've all been able to interact with Pulsar to get here today. So yes, do reach out. And just I want to say a huge thank you again, Ben. Absolutely incredible. And thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Appreciate being here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.